Hi everybody, welcome to Nature Studies. Last week we talked about producers and their role in the ecosystem. This week we're going to talk about consumers. A consumer is something that gets energy from another organism, like a rabbit getting its energy from grass. A primary consumer is a consumer that eats only plants. It does not eat other animals. A secondary consumer will eat those primary consumers. Primary consumers can range in size, all the way from a small beetle like a leaf beetle up to the largest land mammal, the elephant. Primary consumers have special bacteria in their intestines that help them break down the thick cell walls of plants. Insects are the largest group of primary consumers. Some primary consumers are so picky, they only eat one type of plant or product from a plant their whole life. Some examples of that would be the giant panda eating only bamboo leaves and bamboo shoots, or a hummingbird eating only nectar. Secondary consumers are animals that eat only primary consumers. As the food chain goes on, if an animal eats a secondary consumer, it's called a tertiary consumer. And if an animal eats a tertiary consumer, it's called a quaternary consumer. Those are just pretty much like saying it's a first consumer, second consumer, third consumer, and fourth consumer. Secondary consumers and the consumers that eat them are often predators because they have to hunt for their food. Many secondary consumers have specialized teeth to help them rip and tear apart the food that they're eating. Their teeth are very important because they help them to attack the animal and then kill it. Secondary consumers are carnivores. Examples of secondary consumers are things like coyotes and bears and owls and snakes, and even your dog is a secondary consumer. And you are probably a secondary consumer if you eat meat. Secondary consumers are often called predators because they have to hunt for their food. Now that we've learned a little bit about producers and consumers, I think we're ready to make our own food chains. So get out your journal and write your own food chain down. You want to start with a producer, like a grass, and then end with a consumer that doesn't get eaten by anything else. A consumer that doesn't get eaten by anything else is called an apex predator. An example of an apex predator would be something like a coyote or humans. An apex predator is something that's at the very top of the food chain. Here we have my food chain that I did. I started off with crabgrass as my producer, a cricket as my primary consumer, spotted salamander as my secondary consumer, a common ribbon snake as my tertiary consumer, and a bald eagle as my quaternary consumer / apex predator. This is a very common food chain that you would find in the state of Virginia. If you would like to, please ask your parents to send along what you've done. I would love to see your work. I've really been enjoying the emails that you guys have been sending me of the different works that you've done for nature studies. So for just a little bit of fun, I'm going to pull out one of my secondary consumer pets. So this is Toast, and Toast is a perfect example of a secondary consumer because he eats rats, and rats eat producers. The food chain for this particular snake would start with grain as the producer, and then move on to the rat as the primary consumer. And then from there, it goes to him as the secondary consumer.
Here's a close-up. He's so cute.
This is Sushi. She's an axolotl. Sushi eats earthworms. So she is a secondary consumer as well. And this is Ender. He is a dog. He is also a secondary consumer because he eats meat. That's all for today. I'll see you next week.